Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. The National Ranching Heritage Center on the campus of Texas Tech University tells the story of ranching in the American West through over 50 historic structures. One of those structures is the J.A. Milk and Meat House. The J.A. is among the best-known ranches in Texas and perhaps the entire country. The men behind the formation of the J.A. Ranch were trailblazer Charles Goodnight and Irish investment broker John Adair. That partnership dates back to 1877, and the Milk and Meat House was built around 1880 while Goodnight was manager of the ranch. The J.A. Milk and Meat House represents an era when such structures provided an easier way to preserve food, particularly for the large ranches. Typically, these structures had a meat storage and workroom fitted with huge hooks fastened to the rafters. From the hooks hung beef, elk, venison, buffalo, sheep, and pork. On the J.A., 50 people were fed daily, so the supply of fresh meat was always being replenished. Slatted walls on the meat room allowed air circulation, yet were spaced close enough to keep out predators. The milk room was designed with thick walls, a double-glazed window, and water trough. Water flowed from a spring or windmill into the trough, where crocks filled with dairy products, eggs, and other perishable foods were placed in the water. The J.A. Milk and Meat House from the Paladero Canyon demonstrates a simple but clever method for keeping perishable food fresh, and it represents all spring houses erected in the developing West. You can see the J.A. Milk and Meat House in person at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. You can check them out online at ranchingheritage.org. Come experience real ranches, real stories, real heritage at the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. I'd like to start today's show with a poem by Larry McWhorter. Larry McWhorter was a cowboy from the Texas Panhandle who wrote poetry from his own experiences and from stories passed down by old-timers. His father was famed Texas fiddler Frankie McWhorter, who played with Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. And this poem I'm going to start with is entitled The Retirement of Ashtola. In Larry's book, he commented that this is a real person and a real horse set in a fictitious scenario. He went on to say, "My dad worked for Mr. Blackwell at the J.A. and told me some great stories about Ashtola and him. Those two had formed a bond which could only be forged through years of hard work and all kinds of elements." Here's The Retirement of Ashtola by Larry McWhorter. When a day's work is done in the limits of town, a man leaves his job at the site, and he meets with his friends at their pet water hole to watch a big game or a fight. But on the J.A.'s, when the saddles were stripped and the pleasures of town far away, they gathered round the chuck-wagon fire and recalled the events of the day. Wild horses was rode and wide loops were thrown, with no one missing, of course. Then the tales of glory and daring died down, and Boy Blackwell was asked about his horse. Ashtola, the mount of this here account, was a legend who bore the famed brand. This rider and steed were performers of deeds that brought smiles from the hardest old hands. A big old gray horse who was honest of eye, a range-wizened, crusty old bird, and I've heard it said he'd not met the beast that he couldn't put out of the herd. A frustrated cow once used all her tricks, but Ashtola would thwart every plan. Then she got him in close and a little sideways, so under his belly she ran. A lot of horses would have lost her, Boy said, but Ashtola, that cow didn't bother. Well, what did he do? A big-eyed kid bit. Why, son, he went down there and got her. Such were the tales of this cagey old horse. That's why he's remembered in glory. I leave it to you as to whether it's true, but Don't judge till you've heard all my story. The years catch us all, and it was clear late one fall that Ashtola's long race neared its end. So he was given the heave, the J.A. he must leave. An old boy must part with his friend. Somehow that night a gate was left open, and Ashtola escaped in the night. So when the truck from the soap factory came, the gray horse was nowhere in sight. Boy turned him loose in a pasture he knew that was remote and out of the way. As he slipped off the rope and scratched 'tween his ears, to the tired old horse he did say, "You'll not wash the face of some snot-nosed kid. I'd never permit such a thing. You spend your days in the ease that you've earned, and I'll see you come early spring." Well, that winter they had was the toughest in years. 5 northers they seen that was blue. So when the grass turned, with no small concern, boy rode to make sure he'd got through. The canyons were bare, not a soul anywhere, and he wondered, now where can he be? Then he noticed 'fore long that something was wrong. Neither cow nor calf did he see. He topped out to look on a big flat below of the one corner he hadn't been, and the sight that he seen in that valley so green turned his worried frown into a grin. Ashtola had thrown 'em all in a bunch and was working the herd by hisself. Then he thought of the years he'd spent on his back. That old horse never needed my help. 3 cuts he had going, and where he put 'em, they stayed. The cows with bull calves on the right, the cows with heifer calves stood to the left. But boys, here's the curious sight. The third bunch was standing way off to theirselves, and I wondered, now what could they be? So I eased down the hill for a closer look, and you'll never guess what I see. The tension was high among the young bucks, and old boy paused for what seemed like days. Well, what was they, some big-eyed kid bit? Boy grinned at 'em, then he said, "Strays." Legends abound on the Goodnight Range. Some canyons are haunted, I've heard. But the ghosts ceased their mischief and gathered to watch when Ashtola was working the herd. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Buster Welch. Buster Welch is a cutting horse trainer, a rancher, and a cowboy. Buster Welch left home when he was 14 years old and began working on the Proctor Ranch in Midland, Texas. In his younger years, he worked for such legendary ranches as the 4 Sixes, the Pitchfork, the King Ranch, and the Long X. At 93 years old, Buster is a living link to the old-time cowboy and the open-range methods of working with cattle and horses. In 1965, Western Horseman magazine said that in the cutting horse world, the name Buster Welch rings synonymous with ability, ambition, personality, and most of all, success. Buster's a world champion cutting horse rider, and in 2012, he received the Golden Spur Award from the National Ranching Heritage Center in Lubbock, Texas. Quarter Horse News called Buster Welch one of the most celebrated horsemen and cattlemen of the 20th century, and Ian Tyson called Buster the greatest cutting horse trainer of them all. I sat down with Buster at his home in Abilene, Texas, and recorded this interview. Here's Buster Welch.
I was born in Sturgis City, and my dad had a ranch, a little ranch, leased there. And he was having a lot of trouble, and of course he went broke during the Depression. I was born in 1928. My Aunt Novella, no, my Aunt Julia and Uncle Earl had one girl, May Earl, and they, I guess, took me the first year of my life. My Aunt Julia wanted to adopt me, and my dad, I guess, had promised my mother. My mother died when I was 2 weeks old. That he'd keep us together or something, and he wouldn't consent to that. And so she didn't want to keep me anymore. And I imagine, and so my grandparents took me. And that's him. He was a sheriff of Mills County for 25 years and had a little ranch, our little stock farm. They call those ranches today, but they're just, I think probably the most cows he had would have been 50 head or something like that, He ran sheep too. I lived with him until I started school, and I went to Midland. My dad had gone to work for the Atlantic Tank Farm. At first, he went to work riding the pipeline, horseback, had camps, and my oldest brother went with him some, just to be doing something. And he said he'd have meat in those camps that had stuff on them, starting to form. Said he'd scrape it off and boil them and then fry them, steaks. And I would go, when school started, back to Midland and go to school. And then we had 2 or 3 weeks for Christmas, and I'd go back to Sterling on Christmas. My grandmother, Dad, had a ranch up at Cloudcroft, and that was before I was born. And she was up there, stayed up there with him, and talks about how much fun they had at those ranch dances up there. And his headquarters was the water that first furnished Cloudcroft. They just had that land leased from government, and she had high blood pressure, and she came back down and was visiting a friend in Mills County, and my granddad was sheriff there, and met him, and that's their marriage picture, I think, right there. They lived in the bottom of the jailhouse most of the time, but they had a home out on the stock farm, a 2-story house. Their family consisted of 2 boys and 2 girls. 3 girls. And then I came into the picture. As you know, they had big families here. And I found out one reason. The reason was, if a man had property, he wouldn't let it out to you on the shares unless you had big bunch of kids. You couldn't afford to hire enough help, but you could work those kids. And our neighbor was a son of one of his brothers. His name was W. Welch. And he trained Uncle Darrell and Aunt Julia and Aunt Ruby, were going to barber school during the Depression, barber and beauty. And they had a little buggy mare that had spots on her. And they gave her to W.B. He led her the other side of Moon Chapel Church, about 10, 15 miles, horseback, and brought her to a government remount horse. And he got a horse he called Jack's. And he trained him, not on purpose. He trained him using him. And he'd already trained one or two before that. And a cousin of mine, Carlos Knight, was going to Hardin Simmons. He borrowed him, and the first cutting they had at Stanford after World War II, he won the first two go-around. Now, they tell me this. I guess it's true. And, the cattle were getting kind of sour, and you couldn't hold a horn, you couldn't grab the mane, and he had to do all of that to ride old Ajax, and he wound up third. And that was the first money-winning horse of a Welch. And that was probably in, 1946 or somewhere in there. And as you know, there was lots of good cutting horses back in open range day. That was the corrals. That's how they weaned their calves. That's how they cut cattle out to get rid of. And that's how they cut the neighbors' cattle out. Shaped up herds to go north. Goodnight's the man that started that. And that horse was a very important horse for that.
When Buster Welch was 14 years old, he ran away from home and went to work for cowmen Foy and Leonard Proctor on the Proctor Ranch in Midland, Texas. Foy Proctor began ranching in 1917, and his ranches eventually received awards for cattle breeding and soil and water conservation. Foy Proctor was himself a recipient of the National Ranching Heritage Center's Golden Spur Award in 1984.
Foy was just one of those big, smooth men. And one time, I went with him to open closed gates and stuff. And when we got back to Midland, we had shipped 15,000 calves north to the Corn Belt. He had a friend that handled the deal up there. He writes, I've got a good picture of him on the dun horse at the Wasn't a horse. What was it? Oh, 3 Links. Bought that 3 Links right in Arizona. And those little calves, they weaned them, and you could just see them behind him. Looked like they weighed about 300. But he was really a good cowboy. He'd work for wages. His dad came there with, they say, a bunch of horses. And he ran for sheriff one time. And he got beat real bad. Next morning, he shows up on the streets of Midland with a gun strapped on his hip. And a guy asked him, said, I thought you lost. He said, did. But a man that don't have more friends than I do better go on.
Buster, did I read that when you went to work for the Proctors that you were quite young and had ran away from home to find that job?
Yeah. I never did feel like I fit in. They were like strangers to me. And because I'd never been around them much. I'd been, family reunions and picnics and stuff, but it wasn't the same. And I had ran off several times. He'd find me and bring me back. And when I went to work for the Proctors, I think my dad thought I couldn't be in a better place. And because it was a good, straight-run outfit. And my little sister asked him, said, aren't you going after him? He said, honey, I think school is interfering with his education. And he was right. He was right. And I was always a big reader, and so I kind of found out what I needed to know the most, I could have used a better education, no doubt. And I still read. There's a real good new book out, George Washington. He was the first man to breed and raise mules in the United States. And he farmed 80,000 acres of wheat. He had his own grinding mill, ground that wheat, made flour, called it G. Washington. So they gave him credit for being the first to name a food. And he sold it in Europe and the Asian islands. And he sold 11,000 gallons of whiskey a year that he made out of stuff that he raised. And they told me in school that he chopped a cherry tree down.
Another cowboy named James L. Kinney, who had worked for the Proctor Ranch, had this to say about Foy Proctor. Foy Proctor was a prince of a guy and could do anything that a cowboy could do. He could ride broncs, he could rope, and he was a smooth hand at cutting and working a herd. He was also a cow trader and as good a judge of a cow as anybody I ever saw.
James Kinney was close. James went to work for him when he was a kid. And James was really a good hand. But Floyd just had, there was something about him that inspired other cowboys to be better than usual. I never was, other than at James's, that came close to being as smooth a cow work as Forrest. He seemed to just be a walking encyclopedia about a cow and a horse. And it wasn't any effort to him. Just,
Was that your first cowboying experience working for the Proctors, or had you grown up cowboying some
I'd
as a
followed
kid?
ranchers around. I had a famous old ex-cutting horse named Snip. My dad had broke him and traded him to WB when he went broke. And WB trained him. And the Muns give WB, now they told me all this, and I guess it's true. The Mun, Mr. Munn gave WB 6 two-year-old unbroke mules. And of course, a mule was worth more than a horse for him. And they wore him out. And my Uncle Darrell bought some wore-out horses and got him and gave him to me. And I'd go with the cowboys, and he'd get me a lot of attention. They'd come around and talk about what they'd seen him do. And I remember one tale, the cowboy said he saw him jump a little cedar bush and stop as he hit the ground and turn with the cow. Things like that. And he still, one time Mr. Munn came by, he had 250 sheep and got me and Snip, and he guided them, and I herded them. And old Snip just working down that back, and I never would have touch him. When he got to the end, he'd stop and turn around and go back the other way. We drove him over on the Spade Ranch, and I met, he worked for the Spades till they wore out. Well, his dad had a little sheep outfit in the Spade. I'll think of his name, Dickie. But that was a real good old horse, and I was lucky to have got him, and expected a horse to be that good and that smart. And he was darn hard to go pin.
When you went to work for the Proctors, were you able to right away go to work as a cowboy, or were you doing other jobs for them, kind of earning your way up?
I was a pretty darn good cowboy at that age. I don't mean I could go by myself, but I could sure help somebody that was good hand, I'd handled stock all my life. I can remember one time before I went to Midland that I was helping my granddad and someone else, and we were moving probably 100 cattle down the road, down the lane. It was a country road, it wasn't it was just two-track road. They got off, it was real cold, and they got off their horses, went to leading them. And I thought, boy, that's dumb, getting down on that cold ground. And I'd handled livestock, you know. Nearly all ranch kids or farm kids were pretty good stock hands by the time they were probably 8, 9 years old. You know, just to do what they could do. They couldn't rope and trip and head and heel and all that, but they could go open a gate and lope around and turn something, and they knew what was happening, what was supposed to happen. The Germans came over here, I guess you know, in 1914 and bought all of our good horses. And we went to World War I with the cavalry just nearly afoot. And they put out those government remount horses. And boy, that did improve race horses. I guess up then they're just riding little Mustangs and stuff. And some work horses.
Buster, how long did you work for the Proctors?
You know, I never did pay much attention to time. I imagine I was in camp with Benny Sutton down on the driver. I bet 1 or 2 winters. I think I went to work for Roy Parks. I think I was getting to where I wanted to smell perfume and car fumes. That he was about 10 miles from Midland, and I was 45 at Proctor's. That table in the kitchen is Roy Park's table. It was in camp, not that one, the one in the round table. And I bet one time it was their lead furniture. It's real well built. And how I got it, after I left there and was on my own, he jacked that house up and wanted to sell it and get it gone that we were living in, or Andy Hensley was living in. I was living in a bunkhouse. But I would go with the wagon and the cow works and stuff, and then go back there to camp. I went to work for Bob Hill somewhere in there, and Mr. Hill told me the best story. He came from somewhere back, I don't know exactly where, but he wasn't raised in Texas. Somebody told him that a certain guy had 100 horses for sale out at Pecos. He was living in Midland. So he gets on the train, rides out there, got on slippers and a suit coat, clothes, you know. They come to a trade, and the guy points to a horse, said he's been riding something. And Mr. Hill said, would you sell me one of those old saddles? And he did, so he saddled up. The guy offered to help him off of his country. And he's going to Pecos with them to load them on the train. He's driving them along, and he has to go head something, and the horse goes to bucket. Throws him up in the air. Both slippery feet go through the stirrups. He goes down on the horse's hocks. He said the horse was kicking and go up. And so directly he came down behind the saddle, and he climbed back in it. And I went on to Bacon. And but anyway, when Mr. Hill paid for a big old sand ranch up around Kermit, raising mules when the Bankhead Highway was building from coast to coast. And he, of course, had some draft horse in his mares. And when that was over, he went to that government remount horse had come out. And he went to that. But when he worked cattle and he needed a good cutting horseman, he had a neighbor, and I cannot think of his name. And his horses were a little pudding-footed, but boy, they were cow horses. He would get him to come work his herds. And I saw this one time. One of his old horses was coming with a cow. The cattle was real wild then. We were roping all the time, doctoring worms and stuff. And this calf broke to run away from his mother, and that old horse had his foot up to step, and he just held it. And that calf turned around and come back. And that old horse, I thought that, those guys that say they might not could hold a rat out of a woodpile, but they're good cow horses. Of course, that government thoroughbred sure did improve them, too.
You eventually ended up working on the sixes and some of these big outfits in your younger days, riding the rough string. Is that
I could
right?
ride the rough string and get as much as the cowboys. And so I rode the rough string for them. Mr. George had used an old horse called Salty Chief. And I think he was a Joe Reed bred horse. And boy, there was some of them that would sure buck. And I think Mr. George kind of liked to watch him. They say he was a bronc-riding sucker. They say one time a horse was bucking off one of those mesas with him and fell about 3/4 of the way down. And George and him rolled a good ways, and he had to get up and lead him on down. And then he got a trail and went back up where he fell, got back on him, hung him in him again.
I read somewhere that you had a reputation in those days of riding these rough horses and wearing a white shirt, and you were the only one with a clean shirt on at the end of the day.
Well, I don't ever remember one of those rough string horses bucking me off. If they did, I just don't remember it. I had several of them to fall or something. But, we'd go to town and enter them little pumpkin rolling rodeos. We didn't know how to ride a bucking horse, flanked, and nobody else did either. The winners then were Bill and Bud, the big old stout guys. and they'd pull them horses' heads right up against their chest and get them rode and spurred a little. But until Casey came along, nobody.
In a song about Buster Welch and other legends of cutting, songwriter Ian Tyson wrote these words. The legends were young when the range was still open. The cattle still roamed on the land. And they watched and they listened. They learned from the old ones the business of making a hand. They still remember the days with the wagon, working cattle in the old cowboy way. And though times have changed, the legends ride on, and they're still riding with us today. When we first were sitting down in here, you were mentioning that of the prominent cutting horsemen, you were one of the few who really had a background in these kind of open range methods of working cattle and working horses.
I think there was a little class of them that started that had, and when they's gone, they weren't there when I came. And some of them had, I'm sure. Shorty Freeman, now he was a cowboy and a horseman and a good hand, and he worked for me a while. And Andy Hensley quit Roy and tried cutting. The guy they considered the best hand with a horse in California. He was really a good horseman, I guess. There's Andy. He didn't do much good, but here's the guy they considered the best horseman. This is Don Dodge, and this was the captain of the California Cutter.
In an essay entitled Buster from his book Some Horses, Thomas McGuane wrote these words about Buster Welch and cutting horses. Growing up in the Roosevelt years in a part of Texas peculiarly isolated from modern times, Buster was ideally situated to understand and convey the practices of the cowboys of an earlier age to an era rapidly leaving its own mythology. The cutting horse is a sacred link to those times, and its use and performance are closer to the Japanese martial theater than to rodeo. Buster, as you look back over your career, do you have a favorite horse that you look back on?
Oh, yeah. Little Peppy. There never was another. Man's Girl was outstanding, but I possibly could have used Little Peppy, but it wasn't any man thing with Little Peppy. He just was smart. Sucker, I'll tell you. You do not train a cutting horse. You only develop a horse that's got cow in him, wants to work a cow, and you can develop him. And you can add a little extra. I always thought Shorty had the prettiest working horses. I thought Mo had the prettiest working horses, but they didn't train them. They just developed them. And I think maybe the way Mo rode, that little different tilts she had made the horse turn a little harder. I always liked to have her on one of my horses every now and then. There's what I call trainers that want horses breaking and run all the time, and doing a lot of things that is not necessary. I think there's nothing prettier than a good cutting horse working a cow out. I don't like all that chopping and jerking and stuff if it's not necessary. Now, a good cow horse will get mighty fast if he has to hold a cow. He'll give her everything he's got. But for one to do that fake stuff, it don't really appeal to me. And you can teach a good cow horse to do it. But I don't want to criticize too much because they got some good horses. Well, I was always partial to a cutting horse because of the old horse I rode, Snip. And he got me attention. And it's kind of hard for a 4 and 5-year-old kid to get much attention on the cow work. But the cowboys gather around and talk about him and tell about things they'd seen him do. And I noticed the very best cowboys were good horsemen. And the very best cowboys were great gentlemen. If they were nothing, those cowboys were gentlemen. And boy, they're a lot of fun to ride. And I've still got a pretty good little cutting horse that's gentle enough for me to, I've got a deal, I walk up, I turn around, I sit down on the saddle, and then somebody puts my leg over his neck, and he can't hold a rat out of a woodpile, but he's a pretty good little cutting horse. If cattle haven't been messed with much, he's good enough.
When Buster Welch said that the very best cowboys were gentlemen, it reminded me of a poem by Buck Ramsey entitled Defining. You go to defining, you're riding for boggin'. There's no sure way to describe the rhythm and rhyme of the cowpuncher calling, the gist of the cowpuncher tribe. But say we start with an ID of Santee, like Russell, a cowpuncher saint. The best you can say is he's good to his horses. The worst you can say is he ain't. You can't call his rank by the crease of his hat or his get-up, no matter how fine. You go by the moves he makes on his horse. Is he in the right place, the right time? The kind out of old rock and of the long shadow. We'd all like to be of their leather. You say of their makings their water runs deep, and they do with to ride the wild river. They know what the mama cow says to her calf. They're a regular Webster on cattle. They know what the wind says and listen to grass. And they're only plumb whole in the saddle.
Well, they were very, very dependable and honest because we were still working some pastures with 50,000 acres in them. 500,000 acres, I mean. not many, but some. And you wouldn't go off and leave a man that had gone a different way. Bob Bird described that. He said, I had that country lease too. It joined the 18 ranch. It was 6,000 acres, and it was so rough, man. And Bob asked the guys for daylight. He said, I had the biggest crew I'd ever seen, and he's going to a gate. He asked the guy, I said, go back and count the cowboys. I don't want to go off and leave anybody in here. The guy comes loping back up to him and says, Bob, not nary one.
Somebody told me you said that a cowboy knows when to ride up, when to pull up, and when to shut up.
Yeah, right. That's a good saying. Yeah. That's an old cowboy description. I've heard that a lot of times. There was one saying, some kind of talks cheap, takes money to buy whiskey. I probably loved a good horse more than anything. You know you're not going to be able to do that all your life. And I love working livestock. I love ranching. I think I hold a record. I've weaned 200 steer calves in, I think, 2018 that weighed 800 pounds. I kept them 30 days and on grass and delivered them, and they paid on 837 pounds. They brought $1,885 around. That's nearly $2,000. I think I owe it all to Mr. Gardner. Ken and I went up there to buy 4 bulls, and we did. And he's taken us and 2 other big racemen that back to the airport. And I was used to old domino or anxiety or somebody going to save us, you know. So I asked Henry was taking us to the airport, his dad. And I asked him, I said, what bloodline and bull do you think will be popular 5 years from now? He said, I don't know. I don't think anybody in this car knows. But said, we'll know him when he gets here. I thought about that all the way to the airport, and I thought, that man's going to figure it out.
I just want to say thank you, Buster, for letting us come into your home here, and thank you for sharing some stories with us. It's a real honor to get to visit with you.
Well, you're more than welcome, and anytime you want to talk about cutting, come by. We'll talk.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Buster Welch for taking the time to visit with me. I'd like to thank the National Ranching Heritage Center for sponsoring this episode. You can check them out online at ranchingheritage.org. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the theme music for Cowboy Crossroads. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patron, Bob Kelly, for his support. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.